If you only measure the reach and impact of the audio content that comes from your podcast, you're missing a ton.
Speak to us of FOMO, they said.
As we've talked about previously in this course, your B2B podcast should serve as the top of your content waterfall strategy. So if you're not measuring the impact, the reach, and the volume of the content that is coming further downstream from that waterfall, then you're missing a lot of the impact that your podcast is having. And if you're not measuring all that impact, you're likely to lose heart, lose funding, lose buy-in for your podcast that is actually more of a success than others might realize.
People know me.
So in this section of the course, we're going to talk about how to measure the impact of the micro content that comes further downstream in your content waterfall from your B2B podcast, so that you don't have to have an awkward conversation with your CEO just about the download numbers of your podcast, where they don't see the full picture and the full impact that you're working so hard to create. If you're not going to miss the true impact and your leadership team isn't either, let's look at 4 specific content areas where you can measure the impact of micro content coming from your podcast, and then ways to measure each of those content types. Your blog, social media posts, your email, both sales enablement email and marketing email nurture sequences, and your webinars can be fed with fresh content from your podcast through the content waterfall strategy. If you don't know what I'm talking about and I've completely lost you, go back to the previous module that shares the content waterfall strategy and how to execute it with your B2B podcast. All right, assuming you're still with me, let's break down each of these: blog, social media, email, and webinars that are being fed with fresh content from your podcast. And within each of these channels, there are really 3 areas you want to look at: volume, engagement, and conversion. So let's break down blog first. You can look at volume. How many blog posts have been generated that you wouldn't be able to write or write as quickly if you didn't have the podcast feeding you with fresh content to turn into new blog articles? Volume's great, but what's the actual performance? Now you want to look at engagement. So the engagement metric on your blog might be overall visits to your blog. You could look at those page views going up over time. You could look at the impact and the time spent per blog article. Look at your best performing blog articles and then turn those into yet other pieces of content because you see the analytics pointing you in that direction. And obviously, we want to talk about conversion. Look at the blog articles that you're creating. Do you have opportunities for people to convert, to either subscribe to the podcast, or to download a lead magnet, or to get in touch with sales? How many opportunities do they have to convert? How many conversions are you driving? And is that percentage going up over time? Now let's make sure that you're looking as far down the funnel as you can. Those conversions, how many leads are they generating? How many opportunities are being created? How much revenue? As far as you can get down the funnel, as close to closed won as possible, you want to follow the data in each one of these areas. All right, we've talked about blog. Next, we're going to talk about social media. We've talked about how the podcast can help create micro content, how your podcast and other pillar pieces of content can help you build an evangelist program. So it would only make sense that we look at the metrics, the reach, the resonance, and the conversions being driven by your social media content that's being fed from your podcast. So again, similar to your blog, we can look at volume. How many social media posts have you been able to generate because your podcast is serving you with fresh content, fresh ideas, and fresh formats? If LinkedIn is your social media channel of choice, we use a tool called Shield. You can find them at shieldapp.ai. This is a great tool for measuring number of posts, engagement, follower count, and so much more for your evangelists and team members who are using the podcast content to share on social media. All right, on top of the blog and social media, we've got email and webinars as well. So with email, you want to look at how many new emails have we been able to write from the podcast content. Those could be sales enablement, emails that you're able to give to your sales team with resources and copy that speaks to your buyer because you've been interviewing your buyers on the podcast. You could also look at the sequences you're able to build based on the content from your podcast. Oftentimes, we've been able to take some of our best episodes of B2B growth here at Sweetfish and bake those into nurture sequences that get raving reviews from people who are in our long-term nurture sequences. So very much similar to the previous two areas, you want to look at volume of emails, you want to look at engagement, your open rates, your reply rates, your conversion rates, click through on email, much like you will with the blog and social media content. The last one I'll share here is if your webinar strategy is being fed from the podcast, how many more webinars have you been able to do because you have content ideas and guest speakers from your podcast able to contribute? So that's volume. Then look at engagement. How many people are attending? Are more people attending because the podcast where you interview potential buyers is feeding you with fresh content ideas that more buyers want to sign up for? That is a win for your webinar program. And then again, let's not forget about conversion. How many of those turn into leads, they convert to opportunities, and turn into closed-won deals and ultimately revenue? So in these 4 areas of micro content coming from your podcast, you want to make sure you measure and track each one on an ongoing basis. The volume, the engagement, and the conversion. So right below this video, we've got a resource that breaks down these 4 areas with a few additional areas. There might be other types of micro content you're creating and you want to track as well. So you'll be able to track these 4 areas plus any additional ones where you're creating micro content being fed by your podcast. And then in each one, you want to make sure you're tracking volume, engagement, and conversion. Because remember, your podcast is sitting at the top of your content waterfall. It's feeding you with micro content for other channels, for individuals to share, and so many other things. So if you're not measuring its impact all the way down the waterfall, you might lose heart. Your leadership team might question the impact of the podcast. Give them the whole picture. Use these resources to document the full impact of your podcast, including the reach and the impact on revenue of all the micro content coming from it.